If you recently watched Matt Walsh's video on the origins of slavery and were confused as to the point or purpose of that video, don't worry, you're not alone. For those of you who are new here, I'm a law professor and my area of scholarly research is in the laws and codes that sustained and maintained the antebellum slaveocracy in the United States. So I study slave laws and I study slave codes. And when Matt Walsh's video came out, I watched it like an idiot. And as many of you noted, I stayed pretty quiet on the topic for a while. And this perhaps was my chance to jump in and really shine. But I really questioned whether or not it was worth it to even respond, because his video had almost nothing to do with slavery in the United States. His video, and people who take that position, I always respond with, so what? And let me explain what I mean by that. His video was nothing more than to try and deflect and take away the responsibility of the United States for the system of African slavery, the system of race-based slavery that we had here from the founding of the nation until the end of the Civil War, till the 13th Amendment. What a lot of people like Matt Walsh try and do is say, well, look over there was slavery over there too, and it was even worse over there, so therefore slavery here not bad. And I'll agree with him that, of course, there was slavery everywhere in the world, and some forms of that slavery were, in fact, a lot more brutal than the system of African slavery in the antebellum United States. But again, as I just said, my response is always, so what? And I have to be very careful when I say that, because I don't want you to think that I'm taking away from how horrific all these other forms of slavery were, or the responsibility on all of us to actually study and be educated in it. But it's almost like all of these videos, Candace Owens did one for PragerU, now Matt Walsh with this new history series where he started with slavery. It's almost saying, well, because other people did it, therefore we're not as bad. I can't understand, and I believe that the study of slavery in the United States transcends politics. You could be the most die-hard conservative on the planet, and you could still acknowledge that America has sins, America has parts of our past that are very ugly, and acknowledge that we can still believe in American exceptionalism and American greatness, and acknowledge that we did some pretty fudged up things in the past. In fact, I don't think you can honestly believe in American exceptionalism without acknowledging the sins of our past, and the system of African slavery is one of those. So the entirety of Matt Walsh's video was simply to show how slavery existed in other parts of the world and all of this. Matt Walsh and people like that seem to think or believe that the American education system is teaching children that America created slavery, that our form of slavery was the worst, as if you could put slavery in tiers like that and all those things. And that's simply not true. Before becoming a law professor, I taught middle school and high school civics and social studies. So I'm aware of what's being taught in schools. Are there some teachers that probably do teach that? Sure. I mean, of course there are. There's bad teachers everywhere. But I'd say that's less than, a single-digit percentage of teachers in the secondary education system, primary and secondary education system, that get the education of slavery that wrong. No textbook that I've seen teaches that America created slavery. What I see is the actual proper teaching of slavery, which is that it was a race-based system of white supremacy in the United States that treated Africans and people of African descent as property, chattel slavery. And that's something that needs to be understood, and we need to educate American children on. And that's something that we cannot ignore the past and, say, well, because other people did it, it wasn't as bad here. So I watched this entire video waiting for him to talk about slavery in the United States. And the only time that he did was when he brought up how whites were also indentured servants and were practically slaves. And that's the one point that I want to discuss in this video today. Now, I'm not going to lay the foundation for the white supremacist race-based system of African slavery in the United States in each video. For example, talking about the Somerset v. Stewart decision. If I have to lay that foundation, every video will go on forever, and many of my subscribers who have seen it already understand this. So on the main page of my channel, I've put that video, and I'll put it in the video description for you to watch, for you to understand how and why the system of slavery in the United States became based on racial pseudoscience, and it was a race-based white supremacist system, and why I personally believe that is the reason why it is one of the most horrific forms of slavery that has ever existed. That's not to take away or not to say that I'm not also saying it was physically abusive. It most certainly was. Other forms of slavery may have been more physically abusive. That's one of the points Matt Walsh is trying to make. And I agree with him on that. But that doesn't take away from the physical abuse that existed in the American system of African slavery. And also the fact that it was entirely based on white supremacy is what makes it so horrific, because that lingering effect never went away. When you teach individuals that another race of human beings is inferior to you, that their natural place is one of bondage, that you as a white person are a superior race, and it is your duty and your obligation to teach this inferior race, Black Africans, to be better, to perfect them, then when slavery was ended with the 13th Amendment, those racial ideas, that racism that existed in people who had been taught this for generations, didn't simply end with amending the Constitution, right? Unlike other forms of slavery that existed throughout history, where you were captured, and because you were captured, you were now a slave. When that slavery ended, it wasn't an immutable characteristic about you that made you a slave. You weren't inherently inferior to the person who enslaved you. You simply were captured in battle. You owed a debt, something like that. So when slavery ended, if it ever ended, then you were on the same level, at least as a human being, as a creature, as your enslavers. But not in the antebellum South. In the antebellum South, since blacks were considered inferior, they could never, even when slavery ended, be put on an equal footing with white individuals. So I wanted to make this video. I'm going to be making a lot more videos coming in the future. I had to take a little break from YouTube as I was getting something squared away here with my own academic research and scholarly work and stuff like that. But I will be back. I will discuss another point about Matt Walsh's video in the near future, the point about indentured servants. And again, bringing this up, I will show you how the antebellum courts did agree that white people could not be slaves. So while they could be indentured servants, while they could actually be treated in really horrific ways, they could never actually be a slave. And I think that's important to note, because there's something that needs to be understood here. When we talk about slavery in the antebellum South, a lot of people go, well, not all whites owned slaves, and therefore, not everyone was pro-slavery in the South and all of this, and how indentured servants were whites and they were treated just as poorly. You know what? All of these are non-arguments. Every white individual in the antebellum South benefited from, or let's put it this way, or was encouraged by the ruling elite to be pro-slavery, because no matter your status as a white individual, you were still a white individual, and you were above that class, that race that was condemned to slavery.